Not only did Bob Larivee build a car show empire, he also had a knack for being in the right place at the right time.
George was a very reasonable guy. People always want to come in. He said, I'm not opening the door. He said, these people drove up into new roles. So George came out, and he took one look, and he said, oh my God. I said, well, who is it? I didn't recognize him. Well, this was John Lennon and Yoko Ono.
Welcome to What Moves You, a Speedway Motors podcast where we tell the stories behind the cars and the people who build and drive them. I'm Joe McCullough, and in this episode, Bob Larivee Sr. joins us to talk about how he built a car show empire, met some of the most colorful characters in the industry, and helped create awards that the world's top car builders still vie for today.
Well, I sort of always had an interest in cars because I wanted to be in the soapbox derby, and the derby was canceled during the war.
Right.
And so then I couldn't get into it until after the war, and I was 16, and I could only enter 1 year. But I did, and I actually won my first heat, and then that was it. So
you were hooked then?
Yeah.
So, I mean, you were born 1930, right?
Yes.
Which is, the middle of the Depression. Do you have memories of growing up in that era?
I never thought of it as a depression. I didn't know what that word meant. But, my dad was a sign painter working out of his home. He was sort of self-taught, I guess, and they had a rough time, but us kids, there was my brother and I, and we were never aware of it. My dad could always find a truck to letter or a sign to paint for something, and so we always had food on the table and always had nice clothes, and we didn't live in a big fancy house or anything. We had a frame house that my folks had bought about 1925. I had one brother who was older than me, but we never knew what depression meant. We always had. There was always family. There were always people visiting, and my folks played in card clubs and always had friends, and as far as I'm concerned, my growing up was a great time.
And you grew up in Detroit, and
Right.
even then it was the Motor City. What is your first memory of kind of knowing that you were in a car city?
Well, I've told people that there was a racetrack over on 8 Mile Road, and 8 Mile is the dividing line between Detroit and the next cities. So it was called Motor City Speedway, and early on we could hear the cars racing over there, even though it was maybe 5 miles from my house. But when the main event started or whatever, you could hear it, and so we were aware that was going on, and that was always a thrill. And my uncle, who was always seemed to be more willing to do things than my dad, would take us to the races once in a while. So I got to go a couple times, in my earlier days. And then once I got a driver's license, I found out that they opened the gate for the people to leave the track as the main event started. So the minute the flagman dropped the green flag, the guy opened the gate. Once I had my driver's license, we were there, and my friends and we would run in and see the main event. It was that close that we could enjoy that. And maybe that set the pace, although, I went to a real sophisticated high school in Detroit, Cass Technical High School, and it was downtown. And people from all over the city went to this school because they had such a broad approach to education, and I was going to be a dentist. Don't ask me how I came up with that idea, but I took a science biological high school curriculum, and I was accepted for the University of Detroit to be for pre-dental school. But as time went on and as I got a little older, my life changed rapidly. So.
And how so?
Well, of course, when I graduated from high school, I bought a 41 Ford convertible. I thought that was fun. I started painting signs with my dad, waiting to start college. I decided to take a semester off. That was probably a mistake. I met a girl that I fell in love with. And just to avoid being drafted, my cousins and I, who lived close by, we joined the reserves. But before we knew it, they called up the reserves. This was during Korea, and by then I had a child, and so I was called up and went to Texas. That was how I fell in love with the West. I realized that it was my first visit to the West, and I became enamored with the West, and it remained so for the rest of my life. But at any rate, I went into service. My sergeant eventually found out I had a child. You weren't supposed to have any children if you were being called up during the Korean War. He insisted I get out. He told me what to do. I got out, and I went back to Detroit, and all I could think of was hot rods. It was the early 50s, like 1950, 51, and Hot Rod Magazine had come out in 48. I'd had a Whizzer motorbike. I loved the idea of riding around, of going fast, and all of this, and I drove my cars like that. And so I bought a 37 Ford for $35, and a class called Hardtops was starting a race at Motor City Speedway, and it was sort of insane. They started about 24 cars in the main event, 3 abreast, and I can't tell you how crazy it was, but I quickly realized that I had to have a better car, a better engine, and so I got more and more involved in that facet of the sport. At the same time, I joined every club I could, and so I joined a hot rod club in Detroit called Motor City Modified Automobile Club, MMAC, which is still in existence. It had started in 1948, and their goal was to somehow have legal drag racing, which of course didn't exist at the time. So these clubs, there were a lot of them. I mean, basically there were over 100 in the Detroit, lower Michigan area. And they had a meeting one day in the early 50s, and I went to that meeting representing my club, and it was decided that they wanted to build a drag strip. That's what the meeting was about. And how were they going to do this? They were going to start a car show. So they started a show called Autorama at the University of Detroit Fieldhouse. It was a basketball court, the same school where I was going to go to college to become a dentist. And it was successful enough. I wasn't involved in the formation or management of that club at the time, of that association. But that association was a membership of clubs. And at that time, they had probably 50 members, 50 clubs. I was in one of those clubs, MMAC. So the show was very successful. Don't know what that meant. Don't know how many people it was. But they made enough money to think about a drag strip, and they moved to the fairgrounds for a bigger facility. And as the show grew, they decided that they needed some professional help, and they hired a PR guy in Detroit by the name of Don Ridler, and he helped build the attendance. That attendance grew to the point where in 1957, the Michigan Hot Rod Association opened its own drag strip in the little town of New Baltimore, just up north of Detroit. By that time, I was president of the Michigan Hot Rod Association, and obviously in that position, I had become a friend of Don Ridler's, and I became the first manager of the first legitimate drag strip built in Michigan.
So I have to ask, obviously we've got to get back to the Autorama, but younger guys like me who weren't around in the 40s, 50s, sort of the golden age of hot rodding, have nothing but these grainy photos to look at and sort of fantasize about having been there. What was it like to actually be there at the drag strips and street races in the 50s?
Well, it was great. We all thought we were great drivers, and we were all enthused. And the crazy thing about, and I did some drag racing for a year or two, but the great thing about it was that it was a learning experience, because when I got on the racetrack, I realized that everybody in that race, the other 24 drivers, were probably crazier than I was. And so this wasn't going to be a thing where you were just going to jump to the front and win a race. No way. It was a learning experience, and it became that for quite a while. Even though I was willing, it took me a while. I don't think I won a race until about 3 years, when I finally got a better engine. Mm-hmm. And of course, at the same time, I was making more money painting with my dad. I'd become proficient at painting. I went to art school after Korea, and so I was doing pretty good. But at the same time, I had 4 children by the time I was 25. So by 1955, I had 4 children. And so life was always challenging, but I didn't seem to look at it that way. I just thought it was great. I loved going to the races, and I loved being a part of it. In fact, in '58, I bought a Golden Commando powered '58 Plymouth. It was a wagon. The dealer thought I was crazy because it was a 2-door stick shift wagon with a big engine and 2 4-barrel carburetors. So, but that car was very fast, and I had fun with it at the drags. At the same time, I was running much better on the racetrack. I had built better engines. I was making more money. I could afford to get some professional help. And by 1957, I won my first main event at Motor City Speedway, and that was a thrill that I never forgotten.
So how did we get to then the formation of your company, of Promotions Inc.?
Well, in the 50s, Don Ridler sensed that I was very interested in the management of the car show thing. And since I was an officer in the Michigan Hot Rod Association, he sensed that maybe there was a chance for he and I to run some shows in other cities. So I started checking out other cities. And eventually I came up with 3 Canadian cities, Flint and Lansing and some of the other small towns around Detroit. Well, they're not small, but they already had shows being run by mostly clubs. There was a lot of club activity at the time. And so I lined up Windsor, which is right across the border from Detroit, Hamilton, Ontario, and Toronto, which is a major city. And I thought that we were going to do those shows in 1959, but or maybe even earlier than that. But eventually, Don had some setbacks with his business. I don't know exactly what they were, but he pulled out. When it came time to let's go run these shows, he said, "Gee, I don't think I'd better get into this, Bob." He said, "I'm stretched a little thin," and I said, "Okay." So I happened to be talking to my brother one day at a family function. My brother was an attorney, and he was well familiar with the clubs and the success of MHRA because he had incorporated many of those clubs, and he knew about Autorama. He had been to it. And he said, "Gee, that sounds like a fun thing." He said, "Why don't you come down to the office this week and we'll set up something and I can get you the money to start." I needed like $10,000. I was making $100 a week, you know. So that's what happened. I went down, met my brother. We formed a company called Promotions Incorporated, and he got the money, and we were off. In November of 1959, I ran Windsor and Hamilton on ice skating rinks. They had pads that they put down on the ice It was still cold. But at any rate, we lost money on both of those shows. But for me, if I lost $500, that was a lot of money. That was a month's pay. But my brother was encouraging, and I was enthused about it. And so we went up to Toronto in January of 1960. And they had blue laws in Toronto at the time, so you couldn't do anything on Sunday. Nothing was open, not even movie theaters.
Huh.
You were just supposed to go to church and tend to that part of your life. So we ran Friday night and Saturday, and I got the number one station in town to do Chum Radio, CHUM. They did a remote during the show. We drew 14,000 people. We grossed $18,000 because we charged $1.25 and $0.25 for kids. But we made $10,000 in a day and a half. Wow. That was what I made in a year.
Yeah.
So I was a pretty happy guy. And before the spring of 1960 had ended, I had added shows in Buffalo, Indianapolis, and Atlanta, Georgia. I don't know how I did all that, but somehow I was aggressive, and those other shows did not do as well, but they all made a few bucks, and we were happy.
And at the time, the idea of an indoor car show was kind of a new thing, right? Like, what made you believe that that was a formula that was going to work?
Well, there had been shows in California, in Sacramento especially. There was an Autorama in Sacramento. There was an Autorama called show in Hartford, Connecticut, done by a guy named Joe Kaisis. And so these shows were publicized in the magazines. They had started a couple of years before the Detroit Autorama. And so I was aware that there were shows, and there were a lot of club events. Clubs thought of the car shows as a way to make a buck and have a good time. And in my part of the country, in Detroit and in the north, there was no car activity in the winter.
Oh, yeah.
So this was the one chance in the winter for guys to get together, shoot the breeze, and renew friendships. And it was a gathering place. And it became very, very successful. You got to remember that there was no professional football to amount to anything. There was no college football to amount to anything. This is a different era in America.
Yeah.
And obviously things changed a little bit over the years. But in the beginning, we were the big event. And sure, there was an auto show and a home show and sometimes a boat show. But our show fit in perfectly, and we drew a lot of hot rodders.
So we all now know of the Ridler Award given away at the Detroit Autorama every year, and that's the award that guys spend millions of dollars and years of their lives trying to win. How did that award come about?
Well, Don was very creative, and I wanted to mention that the one thing that Don saw was that the show should be more than just a car show. It should appeal to the family. And the way he wanted to do this was bring in musical entertainment. So he brought in groups like Little Anthony and the Imperials and a lot of other groups that you've never heard of, but the Big Bopper was one, who's probably still known by some people. And that accomplished exactly what he wanted to. Our attendance doubled, and pretty soon the shows were becoming more and more successful. And making it family entertainment, we were more like looking at this thing as more like a Disney kind of thing, except we weren't after the little kids or anything like that. But we were after all the adults, and that's what we accomplished. So the way the Ridler Award happened was Don passed away early at a very young age in 1963. He had been with us for a little over 5 years and doing publicity and promotions. And we were looking for a way to add some pizzazz to the shows. We had a meeting to create some kind of a special award. We didn't know what it was going to be, but there have been a couple of guys that have come forward more recently and said that I was the one that said we should call it the Don Ridler Award. I don't remember that, but whatever. It became the Don Ridler Memorial Award, and we started that in 1964. We just wanted to appeal to guys to build a car and to hold that brand new special car and bring it out at the Detroit Autorama. And that's exactly what has happened, and we've succeeded in that regard. I took over producing the Detroit Autorama for the MHRA.
Okay.
And of course I had to resign as president and all this, but I took that over in 1961 and moved the show from the fairgrounds where we had been since the U of D, and we moved to the brand new Cobo Hall. We were the first paid public event in the building downtown, and the show had really taken off. At the same time, I had taken that concept of developing the Detroit show and taken that to many other cities. For example, in 1961, I traveled the country and decided that for the fall of 1960, for the fall of 1960, I would add St. Louis, Pittsburgh, Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio. So we were very aggressive, and probably throughout the 60s, that continued. We just kept expanding, and it wasn't too long. We were running, 25 shows.
Yeah.
And realized that I didn't know exactly how to go about all this. So what I did was I got phone books from all these cities, and I would look up to see if there was a speed shop. And if there was a speed shop, I'd call that speed shop, and I'd ask them, this is really grassroots promotion, but I'd ask them if they had a hot rod show in the city. If they didn't, and I knew, you could get population charts and so forth, and I would compare all that, and I'd say, do you have some club activity in town? Oh, yeah, we have lots of clubs. Okay, I'm going to come down and see what I can put together. And I'd go down, and the speed shops would always work with me, recommend clubs, and I'd meet with clubs and get a sponsoring club like MHRA was in Detroit. And I used that same format. I hired a local PR guy and got the club going, and the club could always make, money. That was the object. But we counted on attendance to really pay all the bills. And that was what was so unique about our business. All public shows, even today, that depend on commercial floor space to pay all the bills. And then if they get any attendance, that's profit. Ours is the opposite. We count on our attendance to pay the bills, and if we can sell some booth space, that'll be extra profit. Okay. So it's sort of reversed. And many people told me that we couldn't be successful doing it the way we were doing it, that eventually we'd fail. Well, that was 70 years ago. So we didn't fail. The company is still going. I don't own it anymore, but we've been quite successful.
So in our timeline here, we're now into the 60s, and I was really interested in reading about this period, that you had some shows that were interrupted by events that, my generation grew up reading about in the history books. And I'm talking about in particular the JFK assassination and Martin Luther King Jr. What happened there?
In the meantime, in the 60s, I had expanded to New York, Chicago. We were doing Montreal, Toronto, all the major cities. And we opened in New York on Thanksgiving in 1963. JFK was shot the next morning. So this was a real disaster because our building, the New York Coliseum, was right on Broadway and 58th Street. And even the police were calling me. All kinds of people were calling, saying, you got to close, you got to close. I went to the building. Well, do I have to close? No, it's up to you if you want to stay open. But Broadway's going to be dark. You're going to be the only show open on Broadway. Well, I said, if I close, I'm out of business. I can't afford that kind of a loss. So we stayed open. A lot of people were unhappy, but the next day the lights came back on, and by Sunday we were drawing somewhat of a crowd, enough to at least keep the loss at an acceptable level. But there were often, setbacks, snowstorms, whatever. But intermixed with that were all the good times that we had, and all the big shows, the successful shows, the shows growing in attendance consistently. And in fact, our goal was there ever going to be a show that would draw 100,000 people? And I'm happy to say that we exceeded that goal many times in the years that we produced the shows.
For pictures from Bob's incredible life and career, check out the toolbox at speedwaymotors.com by clicking the toolbox link on the front page. Check out Bob's new book, Hot Rod Dreams, for even more incredible pictures and stories. If you like what you hear on What Moves You, tell a friend to listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. How did you meet Ed Roth?
Ed, unbeknownst to me, showed up at our Pittsburgh show in 1960 to paint shirts. And he was going to make money painting shirts, which he did. He painted constantly. But he brought a car with him, the Outlaw. And I'd never seen anything like it. I'd never seen a person like Ed Roth. He was the most different kind of guy I ever met, but he was soft-spoken. And eventually I realized that his word was his bond. We became lifelong friends. And I was so impressed with the Outlaw. I think he showed it 2 or 3 times maybe. Then he went back to California. I went to California on my very first trip out there the next spring, and I bought the Outlaw. I think I bought it. I can't really verify it, but I think I bought it for $5,000. I don't know. But by then I had a couple of trucks on the road, not big trucks in the beginning, of course. Eventually we did go to semis, but I bought the Outlaw because I thought that it would be a good feature attraction to haul to our shows. And as a matter of fact, it was such a good feature attraction that the next year I bought the Beatnik Bandit, and eventually I bought the Mysterian. So I had bought 3 of Ed's cars, but I sold those all years and years ago because as I was constantly building and coming up with new car ideas, mostly through guys like Larry Wood, who was head of design at Mattel with Hot Wheels, and people like that, and guys like George Barris, who were building cars that were that the people wanted to see. We just had too many cars, and I had to dispose of them.
Do you have a favorite Roth story?
There must be a good one, but being with Ed was, you never knew what it was going to be. I walked into his studio the first day, and I had a guy with me, my first employee, Ron Eckholm, who was a boyhood friend. And Ed was real friendly, glad to see us, and we shook hands and everything. And we got talking, and he said, what are you guys going to do tomorrow? We said, well, we don't know. We think we're gonna try to produce a program, and we might go out and try to sell some ads in the program to some of the speed shops and manufacturers around town. He said, have you ever been to Disneyland? I said, Disneyland? I said, no. So we went to Disneyland, and if you've seen my new book, there's a picture of Ed riding one of the rides. I took that on that day, because he brought along his wife and some of his kids. I don't know for sure how many kids he had at the time, but eventually he had 5 boys. and most of them were with us that day at Disney. And that was Ed. You never knew what it was going to be. He'd say, let's go to dinner. You want to go to dinner? Sure. Well, we'll go down to the pier. What the heck's the pier? I didn't know what the pier was. Long Beach. And you can get a hot dog. That was dinner for Ed. He was always coming up with things that were fun and exciting and new. I had never met anybody like him, and I probably never will. But we did a lot of stuff together. We did a lot of shows together. I had a bronze made of him and Ratfink on his shoulder called Questionable Counsel. And I just thought he was a terrific guy and a very, very creative guy. The same could be said of most of the customizers, just that everybody had their own niche. George Barris, of course, was certainly the biggest car producer for the studios. Dean Jeffries did a lot, but nowhere near as much as George did. But that's what George wanted to do. He loved publicity. He loved the movie thing. He loved California. A good example of that is one day I was in his office. This story's in my book. And I would sit at a desk there. George became one of my best friends. And I could sit in his office when I had time and think about what I was going to do the next couple of days, and I could call people and set up meetings and that kind of thing. So I took a break. I was walking around the showroom. George had an old dealership on Lancashire in L.A., North L.A., in Hollywood, actually. And this car pulled up, and these people get out. And they weren't dressed very nice. They came up they were trying to get in, and the door, George always kept the front door locked. So I went to George's office, and I told him about these people. I said, they're look too cool, but I said, they want to come in. He said, people always want to come in. He said, I'm not opening the door. I said, these people drove up in the new Rolls. He said, I'll come take a look. Okay. So, and George was a very reasonable guy. So George came out, and he took one look, and he said, oh my God. I said, and this is exactly how it happened. I said, well, who is it? I didn't recognize him. And I always thought of the Beatles as the way they looked in the early days.
Yeah.
That's how I always remembered the Beatles. Well, this was John Lennon and Yoko Ono. So George couldn't wait to get them in. Get the camera.
Oh, yeah.
So there's a picture of them in my book, and I took the picture and wrote the story. So you just never knew what was going to happen with these guys, and it was always fun and exciting. It was great. I love going to California.
Well, and you started bringing celebrities into your shows to kind of boost, attendance and people wanting to meet these celebrities. Is there anybody that stands out, or any stories from doing that really stands out to you?
Well, the way that happened was there was another show producer, a guy by the name of Chris Christensen from Grand Rapids. Eventually, Chris produced shows in the middle of the country. We called him the Great Kahuna of the Corn Belt. He was about 6'4", weighed about 300 pounds, and smoked cigars about a foot long. And he was another character, but he was a good guy. And he had booked the pig from the Green Acres, is that what it was called? And he had booked that pig into his shows in these farm shows in these small cities in Iowa, and the pig had gone over quite well. So he came to me one day. I got to know Chris quite well. Eventually, I bought all of his shows, and he said, Bob, he said, I've been hanging out a lot in California. He said, I've met some celebrities like Telly Savalas and some of these guys, and he said, why don't we try to use a TV celebrity in one of your shows? And I said, geez, how would we line them up? He said, I'll take care of it. You give me a piece of the increased gate, and we'll line somebody up. So The first one he lined up was Adam West, Batman.
Mm-hmm.
And then he got Burt Ward. So Adam and Burt were both going to appear at a show. So he came to me and he said, I've got these guys set, and he said they want to do it in costume. I said, oh, geez, that's sort of crazy, but that's great. So I checked it out, and I found out that they didn't own the costume rights. Warner Brothers had sold the costume rights to a New York show producer by the name of Roger Hess. So I flew to New York, met with Roger, and made a deal with Roger. And in fact, we became lifelong friends. And I can't remember what the deal was, but whatever it was, it's worked. So then Chris said, well, give me a show where we can try this. I said, okay, how about Dallas? I said, Dallas is coming up, and I don't have too much going there. And I said, you and I will work it. He said, no, I don't want to work with you. I said, you don't want to work with me. Who do you want to work with? I want to work with your son. My son was 19 years old at the time. He had just run his first show. I said, well, okay. I guess Bobby's capable. I said, the family called him Bobby, the business called him JR. He and Chris and Bob went down to Dallas, and they absolutely doubled the attendance. Packed the show. And of course, Adam and Burt showed up. Big success. And we said, wow, now we had to buy TV advertising. So that changed the whole format of how we were advertising our shows.
Right.
But at any rate, it worked. And the next thing he came up with was Marty Milner and Kent McCord from Adam 12. Marty Milner was well known. He had a TV show called Route 66 with a Corvette. A lot of people knew of him. And that show was, I'm talking about the times when these shows were still on TV. So
right.
They were very, very popular. And again, gigantic crowds. I mean, I've got, as a matter of fact, recently I met Marty Milner after, or Kent McCord, having not seen him in probably 30 years or more, 40 years maybe, I don't know. Probably 40 years. And he said, Bob, he said, he called me on the phone one day. I had called around, left word, and he finally called me. And we talked for quite a while, and he said, Bob, he said, I need a favor. I said, what's that? He said, I don't have any pictures, and he said, I know we drew big crowds. He said, I would love to have some pictures of that. Do you have any photographs? I said, yeah, I'm sure I can come up with half a dozen at least. I said, but I need a favor. He said, what's that? I said, I'll meet you for lunch the next time I'm in L.A., and I'll have the pictures with me. And that's exactly what happened. We met on Ventura Boulevard, and we spent 2 hours talking about the old days. And he looked exactly the same, looked like he weighed the same, except he had gray hair.
Yeah.
Of course, so did I. So those relationships were really terrific. I got to know Leonard Nimoy very well. Had lunch at his house. He had lunch at my house. So many of the celebrities became a major part of our shows. John Stamos, the list is almost endless. So, but anyway, that's what we did to promote the shows. Anything we could do, whether they were sports figures, racing figures, or whatever, they became part of our agenda.
Now, through all of this show car stuff and growing your company, were you still racing?
I raced, well, that's sort of funny because I quit in 57. They tore down Motor City Speedway, I believe, in 58. And so that's where I had spent most of my days in the 50s racing, and there were other tracks around, but I ran mostly at Motor City. There was also a track over in Mount Clemens. And I thought I was probably done because my business was taking all my time. But about 5 years later, my employees were going to the races all the time out at Mount Clemens, which had a quarter mile and a half mile. At that time, they were dirt. And I had always talked to them. How were the races last night? And who's running? And because I knew quite a few of the drivers. And finally, they came to me and they said, "Bob, we want to build a sportsman car. We want to go racing." I said, "Oh God, you don't want to do that." Yeah, we want to do that. So I let them do it in the shop, and we went, and I became a part of it. And so here, I started driving part-time. One of the other guys that worked for me, he was driving, and we were sharing it. And actually, I was doing pretty good. So the next year, we bought the car that won the championship the previous year, and we went out and we won quite a few. We won main events. We qualified fastest. We did very well. And then the next year, I think we only ran sportsman 2 years. I'm not sure. The next year, we went to what they call late models. Today, they're called super lates. And so I ran that up to 77. So for quite a while, we ended up with Camaros. They looked like Camaros. They were full-blown race cars. And in fact, one of the cars is in the museum here. So, but it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. But my business grew and grew. And in fact, by 1982, we were running almost 100 shows a year. And we were involved in all kinds of things, like producing a program that sold 300,000-400,000 copies a year, and producing books, and just doing all kinds of other things. I had gotten involved in other aspects of the sport, like automotive art, and it just became too much, and I quit racing in 77. I was going to race till I was 50. I quit after I was just going on 47. So great time. I really loved it. I loved the drivers. I especially like racing in Canada. I had a big thrill over there. We were running a championship sponsored by Export A and Carling's, Export A cigarettes and Carling's. And we ran 24 races of 100 laps or more. And I finished second in a 250-lap race up at 5/8 mile track by Niagara Falls called Cayuga Speedway. And I know it doesn't sound right to say it was a big thrill to finish second, but they started about 40 cars, and it was like a NASCAR race. It looked like a NASCAR race, and it was a big thrill. And so I really enjoyed it. I sort of wished I would have stayed at it longer, but I guess it was time to quit, and I went on to other things.
You mentioned the fine art thing, and you were the founder, right, of the Automotive Fine Art Society, and had a lot to do with that fine art exhibition that still happens at SEMA, right?
You mentioned the Fine Art Society. I was instrumental in getting that going.
Okay.
But their main show was at Pebble Beach.
Okay.
And they were professional artists from all over the world, basically. We had a guy from Germany. We had a couple of British guys, Canadians, France. And it was a great thrill to be a part of that. But I produced the show in the beginning and was a part of it for 33 years. But I was never an artist. I made a lot of great friends, but what I did was started a show at SEMA called Hot Rod Heritage Fine Art. And I can't tell you when that was, but it was about 1980 or the late 70s maybe. And we ran that show for about 25 years. And at that point, I was representing about 40 artists. I actually bought a lot of the art and framed it and showed it. And we did quite well. We had a big area. Sometimes we had, 3,000 square foot of exhibit space that SEMA would give us. eventually, SEMA decided they wanted to run this art exhibit themselves. And so they cut the number of artists way down, and that's how it's run today. It's managed by SEMA, and they have about 12 artists, and they consider me one artist, but I represent about 8 artists in my booth. And I do that with my daughter, Janine. In fact, I have 3 daughters. 2 of them are really into the sport. Janine and my daughter, Tracy, are both avid hot rod enthusiasts. And it's fun working with Janine on that particular event. We do it together each year.
And does your interest in automotive art go back to your days in art school and working with your dad as a sign painter?
I never thought of myself as being an artist. Although in a sense it is, but you know, I could never do what these guys do.
Yeah.
I mean, these artists are terrific. I mean, they're guys like Tom Fritz and Ken Eberts and so many others, Kenny Youngblood. In fact, I've been nominating some of them for the SEMA Hall of Fame and for the Grand National Roadster Show Hall of Fame. They're fantastic artists and have not been recognized as being a major part of the hot rod sport, but they really are, because they're painting, most of them paint historical. So they're painting scenes. A lot of the art is signed by the people that they're painting, the racers, and it's just a terrific way to help keep the whole sport alive. So I've really enjoyed being a part of it, and I'll do that as long as I can. So.
And I should mention that we're recording this interview in the gallery here at the Museum of American Speed. There's a couple Tom Fritz paintings right over your shoulder, and you sort of helped put this together, right?
Yeah. Well, Clay was very supportive, and Tim, and so it wasn't just me, of course, but I lined up the art. I contacted about 40 artists, and almost everybody was enthused about it and donated the art. Some of it's original art, some of it is prints. But the great thing about it, and in fact, right now, so far as I know, this is the only gallery like this in America. And if anybody is interested in automotive art, there's no better place than right here to get a comparison idea of what is available. And the museum has gone far enough to put a identification tab on each of these pieces of art, so with your phone you can contact any one of these artists. And if you are so desired, you could get a painting commissioned by any one of these artists. And that's what's great. And that's what was great about SEMA and Pebble Beach. And you go to these shows, and there is no museum that features hot rod art in the country that I know of. And I know everything that's happened in the last 40 years or so. And here you can compare all these artists, and many of them paint for a living. That's what they do. That's all they've ever done. So a lot of them have gone to either CCS, Center for Creative Studies in California, or there's a similar school in Detroit. It's a big thrill for me to have been a part of this exhibit, and I hope the public appreciates it as much as I do.
And you also, in addition to everything that we've been talking about, have several books published to your name. How did that get started? What made you want to start writing books?
That's a whole other story. I always liked the idea. I'm a real history buff. Like, for example, I've been to most Civil War battlefields. I've been to Normandy 4 or 5 times. I've been to Bastogne. I love doing that kind of thing. And the same thing applies to my life. I've been very avid about collecting pictures and having scrapbooks and all that. And the same thing applies to my business and to the hobby. So I was walking through a gallery in Taos, New Mexico, and I saw a book called 20 Years with the Cowboy Artists of America. And I was just starting to get interested in Western art. Mm-hmm. And in fact, that Western art, that interest in Western art eventually led to my interest in automotive art. You know, it's different, but it's in a way it's the same. So I saw this book. It had been published in Flagstaff, Arizona. I said, gee, that's exactly what I want. 20 years with the International Championship Auto Shows. And so, naive enough, not knowing where to begin, I called the company, Northland Press. And I said, look, you've done this book. I said, I want to do a book similar, but about a different subject, about hot rods. And they said, boy, our president is a car enthusiast. He's got a Porsche. I said, let me talk to him. So I talked to a guy named Mark Sanders. We became lifelong friends. I don't know how I meet these guys, but anyway, the result was a book that came out in 1980, and it told the first 20 years of my business. Mm-hmm. And it was put together by a guy that worked for me, a guy named Mike Sheridan, who was in charge of my programs at the time that we published for the car shows, and another guy by the name of Sam Bushala, who owned an ad agency. And the book is still a desirable book today, although, of course, it's long sold out. Mm-hmm. But it was a beautiful book. I did real quality paper, hardcover, and it's called Showtime. Like I say, it's really a neat book, and I always liked that idea of doing something about history. So I followed that with I've done what I call 10 publications. I did the definitive history of the Hera Museum in Reno, which a lot of people maybe don't know about, but it was the largest collection in the world with 1,400 cars. I hired a guy named Dean Batchelor to write that. We followed that up with a book on the Cunningham Museum in California. Briggs Cunningham, who had won the America's Cup and who designed and built the Cunningham cars. Yeah. He raced at Le Mans. And then I did a small book on automotive art, on the artists of Pebble Beach. And in the last 4 years, since I'm not running car shows anymore, I've done 4 books on the hot rod scene. And the last one is called Hot Rod Dreams, which is selling very well. It's got the Red Baron on the cover, which is featured, of course, here at the museum. So I did a very successful book on Detroit called Hot Rod Detroit, and followed that up with another book called Hot Rod Detroit Pictorial, an all-picture book. All these books have sold out except for the last. I've only got one book now that's not really sold out. So I'm working on more. I hope there'll be more. We'll see.
How did you meet Speedy Bill Smith?
Well, Speedy Bill is a legend, and in that regard, I mean, I always knew his name. I didn't know him, but he and I started going. We went to the Hera's auctions when Hera sold out because Bill Hera died. Holiday Inn bought the Hera collection, and Holiday Inn didn't want 1,400 cars, so they gave 250 cars to the city of Reno to build the William F. Hera Foundation Museum, and they sold the rest of the cars at no reserve auctions over a 3-year period. Bill bought some cars. I bought a couple. Bill and I started trading cars, and that's when I really started talking to him a lot. And he told me he had a business in Lincoln, Nebraska. And where's Lincoln? Well, I found out that I go right through it driving to Colorado where I have a home. Mm-hmm. So I stopped in and sort of fell in love with the museum idea. It wasn't here, of course. It was a much smaller museum at the time, but mm-hmm. I still loved what Bill was doing. I've always liked race cars. And at that time, it was all race cars.
Right.
Mostly sprint cars and midgets and that kind of thing. And so Bill and I became friends.
So how then, as we sit here in the museum, there are a lot of your cars and memorabilia that you had collected over the years are here in the museum. How did that relationship come to be?
To be quite truthful, I decided that life would be better if I sold a couple of my things. And so I contacted Bill. I had a collection of engines, and Bill came out to what I call the ranch, my place in Colorado, and looked around and didn't say anything, just walked around, he and Joyce, and it was cold out. I said, let's get out of here. I said, I'm freezing. So we went to a restaurant, and I said, I wanted to sell one engine. And I said, are you interested? And I said, I just want to sell one engine. He said, well, I'm not interested in that. And I said, oh, you're not? And he said, no. He said, I want all your engines. And I said, they're not for sale. And he said, well, I'll make you an offer you can't refuse. So all I can tell you is he did, and it went beyond that and included my collection a few years later, and I've been happy ever since. I know where the main part of my racing memorabilia is, and some of the great cars that we built, and I'm proud to be here and to be a part of this collection and to see it grow the way it has. It's been really phenomenal, and I've really enjoyed meeting everybody and working with them, and I hope that continues for a while. So,
you are now 92, right?
I'll be 92 in December.
Okay.
2 months.
So you have, obviously this legendary lifetime of work behind you. What do you see? What are you going to do next?
Well, I'm not going to be doing as much. I'm seeing that my health is that I'm getting old, like everybody that gets to my age. Slowing down maybe a little bit. My kids are important to me. My boys are gone, unfortunately. Both my sons have passed away. I'm real close to my daughters, my youngest one especially, who's still single, is a joy. We do a lot of things together. We've been to Europe. We go to Disney quite a bit. And I'm happy with all that. But mainly what I want to do is I've really enjoyed doing these books. I like being a part of it. I like talking to people. I like going to events. I'm in a number of halls of fame. I like going to the Grand National Roadster Show. And of course, the Detroit Autorama is my home. And I've made friends doing my business all over the country. So I have a lot of friends in California. Unlike some people, I got to know all my heroes out there. All the guys that built the hot rod sport. I've just been talking to Wally Park's son about a project he's working on. And so I just love being a part of the hot rod sport in any way that I can. And so we're going to do, Larry Erickson and I, the guy I did the last book with, we're going to do a book on the Ridler. It's the 60th anniversary of the Ridler in 2024. And I hope to get that book done for the next year. And then I'm also working on my biography, and that's all written. I'm just starting to gather the pictures. I hope to have that done in less than a year. So there's always projects.
Thanks to Bob Larivee for joining us, and thanks to all of you for listening to What Moves You, a Speedway Motors podcast. To see photos of Bob and lots more from today's episode, visit the toolbox at speedwaymotors.com. Email the podcast at podcast@speedwaymotors.com, and if you like what you hear, tell a friend where to find us. It's hard to believe, but we have reached the end of Season 3. Thank you so much for listening to our third season of What Moves You.